Vito and Patrick, and we're here to talk about the future of the automotive industry. In fact, the competition thus far has actually got us really excited about the future. Yesterday we talked about 3D printing, talked about IT infrastructure, and now what's cooler than the futuristic idea of rechargeable cars or battery-operated cars. In fact, the prospect about battery-operated cars have been so positive, and the outlook of the market has been so positive, that even industry movers and shakers, such as Elon Musk running Tesla, actually doubled down his investment in electronic cars. He said, this was the way the future is going to go, and this is where I have to be, and this is where it's going to be profitable. Just in the first quarter of this year alone, he actually invested so much money entering the Chinese market and trying to sell his Tesla Model S. And we see that as a good sign and a good show of faith from the movers and shakers in the industry as to where the electric car industry will be going, or EV, electric vehicles. However, it is not easy. In fact, Tesla's venture into China and Elon Musk's optimism about it didn't really make it any easier. And we see that it is an industry that is still undergoing growing pains. When you look at the biggest players in the industry, particularly in the battery manufacturers, these are the people pushing for electronic cars. They're the biggest players because they're the ones collaborating with car manufacturers in making battery-powered cars a reality. We look at Panasonic, LG Chemical, and Samsung SDI. We're actually having certain troubles and again experiencing growing pains with the industry. We look at here just a short snapshot of the things that are being reflected in their financial statements to show the difficulty in growing the industry. We look at Panasonic, they're becoming more highly leveraged, meaning they have to borrow money to support their investment. We look at LG Chemical, they have declining gross profit margins. Actually, we notice across the board that gross profit margins for these battery manufacturers are actually really small. We're looking at a debt to equity ratio for 1:2, and we see that the pains of the industry are being reflected with these companies, and that's why we see that these manufacturers actually have the best interest and actually are in the best position to do something about it, to grow the market and urge it further. Which is why we're very excited to talk to you about our plans and how we're going to do that and to electrify the market. And we see that this is the problem. How can EV battery manufacturers overcome industry uncertainties and obstacles to ensure profitability in an age wherein there is a trend of intense consolidation, intense competition, and actually a slower than expected market growth? We see that it's a tricky position for them. However, we are very positive that they can do something about it. And this is what we plan to share with these battery manufacturers. Our car strategy. First, we want to make sure they collaborate within the industry. It is a growing industry, it is a new market, and therefore a certain degree of collaboration rather than intense competition has to be undertaken by these companies. Second, they have to align the interests of different parts of the value chain and their supply chain. Again, it's quite fragmented, being a new market, and we see that there's an opportunity for them to align the interests and make sure they work well together to produce better output and greater efficiencies. And lastly, they have to respond to competitive threat. We're talking about the three incumbents or leaders in the industry. And you always have China and the growth of the economy in China and the companies in China breathing down your neck. So we feel that they have to respond to this as well. So we've broken down our strategy into three key issues, and that's how we analyze this case. First, we look at the first issue or the problem, underutilization of production capacity due to the underperformance of the market. Meaning, we were so optimistic about the market trends, but nobody bought these cars. Actually, we only achieved about 50% with the Nissan Leaf, and the same with the GM electric cars. They only achieve about 50% of their target. We see that as a problem. Second, we want to look at strategic value chain initiatives for greater efficiencies in growth, performance enhancement, and even cost efficiencies to really drive the cost of these batteries. And essentially, the end product, EV cars, they have to go down to make them more marketable and commercially viable. And lastly, we look at the competition from new entrants, meaning the Chinese manufacturers. They're going to undercut you, they're going to start a price war eventually. So we have to be preventive and we have to respond to them as quickly and as effectively as possible. I'll now turn you over to Martha to talk about the first issue of underutilization.
Alright, thank you, Janine. So the first issue is really underutilization of the production capacity, which is really caused by the poor market performance. Now, we see from these figures now that actually LG Chemical and Samsung SDI, their utilization has actually dropped from like 77 to 60% and from 86 to 77. In fact, at one point, LG Chemical actually, their utilization dropped to around 30%, which led to a closing of one of their US factories. So really, this is a big issue for the industry. And we see that the actual cause of this is really because the electronic vehicle market pie is really small. In terms of the whole automobile industry, it only accounts for 3% of sales. And again, as Janina mentioned earlier, companies are underperforming. They're only reaching around 50% or less of their sales targets. And this is clearly a demand issue. There really has been insufficient demand to meet the production of the companies. So why is this happening? What are the causes of this underutilization and lack of demand? So first is really the high prices of the vehicles, because again they're not as widespread. There's still a new product, so really the prices are still very high, and companies haven't really achieved scale yet because again the demand is not enough for them to be able to achieve this scale. Second, the performance quality is again another issue for them. However, we feel that these two first issues are actually issues that can be solved by achieving scale and efficiencies within the value chain. And we will be discussing our recommendations for this later on. But lastly, the main issue that I want to discuss right now is the infrastructure, mainly the charging stations. Now, as much as I would love to have an electric vehicle myself, my main concern with this is that what if the charging stations are so little, they're so far away, and if I'm driving to one and I suddenly run out of battery, so I'd find myself having to push a huge and heavy car, which I don't think I really can handle. So really, this is a big issue for a lot of the consumers now, is that even though we want to be environmentally friendly, even though we want to have electronic vehicles, really it's an issue of infrastructure. The charging stations aren't available, and they need to be made available for me to be able to achieve that demand. So really, for these companies, we see that our main insight here is the infrastructure is really necessary to growing this pie, to be able to get electronic vehicles to actually increase market share in terms of automobile sales. Now, of course, the main issue with infrastructure is always the huge investment that it requires to be able to establish these charging stations. Now, these companies, as Janina mentioned earlier, they're already heavily in debt. They're already getting a lot of investment from shareholders. They're actually, a lot of them are experiencing operating losses. So we see that what the key to this, the way that they can actually achieve scale, is that they really have to collaborate together. These manufacturers have to collaborate. Even though they are competitors, it is necessary. So we look at, let's say, Android, the Android consortium. They're all a consortium of competitors. However, they needed to work together to be able to achieve that scale, to be able to get the market share from Apple, and they were able to successfully do this. So we see that this is a strategy that these manufacturers can actually employ. Right, so now I'll turn you over to Vito to discuss the second issue, which is about value chain.
Alright, so now let's talk about the value chain of the actual electric car industry. So we broke it down into really, let's look at the three main players before we go to the dealers and the customers. So that's the sub-suppliers, the battery manufacturers, or that's us, and the car makers themselves. So when we look at the sub-suppliers, you're talking about the people who actually give us the components that we need to produce our battery. So in the case of lithium ion, it's about the chemicals that are needed to go into the actual production of battery. So what can we see from this, analyzing this value chain? Well, first of all, next slide please. First of all, it's that 50% of the cost of the cars is actually in the batteries themselves. It means the biggest part of the investment comes in the batteries, and therefore if we're trying to gain greater efficiencies in terms of lowering the price of our cars to make them more affordable for people to use every day, then we have to analyze or look into batteries and how can we make them cheaper. Second, so they're the most critical component, and that issues of high prices and performance are mainly addressed through the production of batteries. So what are the current things that companies are doing in order to lower the price of batteries? We've seen that there have been acquisitions, there have been joint ventures, and there have been vertical integrations within the value chain. And we see that these are actually good. These are the ways to go to actually lower the cost. Because we believe that in order to achieve lower costs, better quality of your products, and developing competitive advantage, you can't look at your company in isolation. You can't look at the battery manufacturer in isolation, because they are all working together to actually produce a great car. And really, if underutilization is happening in terms of the production of batteries, then not only are battery manufacturers hindered, but also the rest of the supply chain. Those who are actually supplying to these battery manufacturers are also being heavily affected by low sales in electric cars. So we believe that close collaboration within the value chain will be tantamount to actually producing the level of sales or the level of efficiency that will be required to make the battery-powered cars practical for an everyday consumer to use. So really our strategy here is we have to enable the ecosystem to improve. And that will really boil down to a sharing of information regarding the technologies needed to make them efficiencies possible. So that's not just talking about making the best battery available, but making the battery that best fits a certain type of car or best fits the ergonomics of a certain type of car. So these are things that we believe will only be possible when different parts of the value chain communicate with each other. And therefore we believe that is the way to go. But we can't be limited to just a value chain within a certain sector of the industry or within a certain sector of the world. And we believe that that's the second thing that we have to address, that really we have to look at the supply chain not in isolation but also in the global supply chain. And we have to face certain realities that Chinese car manufacturers in terms of electric powered cars are actually on the rise. And the reasons for this are many, but we broke it down into two main reasons. And the first reason is that they're receiving great tax breaks, they're receiving subsidies from the Chinese government in order to push for this type of development, because they do recognize that's the future of cars. And second, that actually battery suppliers from China pose the threat of low-cost disruption. They're able to produce the batteries at a lower cost than us. And therefore, car manufacturers there, like Wanxiang and Candy, were able to defeat other Western car manufacturers like Tesla in terms of cost. So they were able to capture a lot of the market in China. And that was really evident when we saw that their unit sales increased from 5,000 to 29,000. So that's almost 6 times fold in the span of 1 year, just because they were able to cater to the market with practicality and cost efficiency. So in other words, the reality of it and our strategy is that we need to tap into these Chinese suppliers in order to mitigate the cost leadership that they may have in the future. We cannot allow them to grow into such a huge powerhouse such that in the future we are not able to compete with them anymore. So therefore, it's when we break down our three main strategies, our first strategy is about growing the industry by laying down the infrastructure. Our second is having more efficiencies through collaboration within the value chain. And our third is not looking at the supply chain in isolation, but looking at it through a global scale and looking at areas where we can increase efficiency and cost reduction through maybe looking at Chinese manufacturers or Chinese component manufacturers for batteries. So now that we've talked about our three main strategies, I'll pass you on to Patrick to give you the implementation plan.
Thank you, Vito. So now electric cars are at the turning point, and the future is really far from now. But the way to time travel to that future is really by removing the different obstacles that we have today. And the way to do that is through our car strategy. First of all, we have to collaborate throughout the industry, and this could mean collaborating with our competitors, which I'll talk about later. The second is we have to align the interests of the different parts of our value chain in our ecosystem, because we want to encourage the different parts of them to grow so that the quality of our product and as well as the price will be much better. And finally, we have to respond to the competitive threats, especially when it comes to, as Vito talked about earlier, the incoming Chinese suppliers that could possibly disrupt us through low-cost disruption. So let's first talk about how we can collaborate. And the answer to that is to actually collaboratively build and develop infrastructure. And the infrastructure we want to develop is actually charging stations. And why should we do this? So partly because the joint venture between large players will be possible because of three things. First of all, it's going to be able to increase the demand for cars, because as Margaret talked about earlier, a lot of the problems with cars hinge on having not enough charging stations. So we saw this as a bottleneck to serving our customers. And actually, there's a story about a rich Chinese person, and what he did was actually he was so angry at Tesla that he actually broke his Tesla car because there's not enough charging station and there was a delay in him receiving his car. And secondly, we think that our competitors will buy in because we allow everyone to share the risk throughout the industry. And lastly, we can also use the charging stations to create a barrier of entry if we only allow the cars that work with our companies, which is Panasonic, LG, and Samsung, to use these charging stations. Therefore, not allowing the Chinese competitors to actually compete with us. So how are we going to do this? We can apply best practices, and we can even look to Tesla charging stations today and how they do it. And one of the things they do is actually they charge it through solar panels, And another thing they do is they actually have waiting stations in their cars, because typically when you charge your car in battery stations, it could take you maybe 1 or 2 hours. But they also have a premium product where you can actually charge your cars faster, and you add price to the customers for doing that. So that's how we could implement charging stations. And the second thing is about having close collaboration throughout the supply chain. And we think that's essential. And the way to do this is, first of all, collaborate through our OEMs through sharing information. And actually, different car manufacturers are doing that today, like Tesla and BMW. They're actually gathering data from their end product and sending it back to their factories so that they can constantly improve it through this thing called the Internet of Things. They send data from their cars and get feedback from customers. And I think that the way we can do this is to actually share that data throughout the entire industry, so that even the battery manufacturers, the car developers, and the suppliers for the parts of the batteries can look to new ways to improve their product, to serve their customers much better. Another thing is we can actually focus on single sourcing rather than multiple sourcing. And the reason why we want to do that is because we feel that a lot of our sources today aren't big enough, and we have to encourage their growth. And by encouraging their growth, we can do two things. First of all, we can ensure that the quality will become better, because they'll have enough margins to actually spend on R&D and improve their product. And secondly, through our volume orders, we can actually help them achieve economies of scale, which will lower the prices down even further. And lastly, we want to have more battery recycling collaboration, because we want to reuse the batteries that we have, that the customers have been using, and we want to put this back into our production process. And all of these things will help align incentives of the entire industry to become better at serving their customers. And lastly,
team, you have 3 minutes left.
we want to also implement, we want to respond to the Chinese market through the entering Chinese suppliers, through global sourcing through some of these Chinese suppliers. So when it comes to parts that aren't the battery itself, we can actually look to working with these Chinese suppliers. And the way to do that is to hire local purchasing arms. So that because these people can understand the market better. I mean, there are a lot of companies that have tried to enter China but have a hard time because they don't understand the market or they don't understand supplier relationships. And that's why it's important for us to reach out to locals to be able to tap into the supplier market more efficiently. And so now that I've talked about how we can execute our plan, let me now pass you on to Janina to talk about our risk analysis.
Thank you, Patrick. Now that we've heard our plans, and though we're very positive about the outlook when it comes to the industry, especially with the implementation of our strategy, we do recognize that with any new market, with any new technology, there are going to be risks. And the first risk is actually very common to the industry. It's already happened even. That the slow growth of EV sales and demand. Because now we're forecasting and we're putting a lot of optimism again into the market. However, we've seen in the past that optimism doesn't really translate automatically to sales. And we see that that is still a risk that we're facing right now. And as battery operators, we bear the burden because what are we fighting against? Sunk costs and sunk investments. That's something we want to avoid. So first, we look at our mitigation strategy for missing our demand, or car manufacturers missing their demand targets. First, we want to make sure that we grow and develop infrastructure. Again, it's a user problem. How can I buy your car if I am not going to be able to use it? And as Patrick talked about earlier, they just really hate the car and they just smash it. So we feel that in order to avoid those sentiments, it's really important to grow and develop infrastructure. And collaboration in that sense is really important. And second, we have to improve production quality and efficiency. Drive costs lower, put quality upwards. We think that that's a way to make it more marketable and to make it more commercially viable. However, in the worst case scenario, our contingency is really a market reevaluation, where we have to reanalyze why isn't the uptake there. Because all market trends are pointing that it should be selling. However, we have to look for maybe bottlenecks, we have to look for change in consumer preferences. And that's something that battery manufacturers can actually spearhead and can actually use the data they've collected in the past to do so. Our second risk that we identified is low-end disruption from Chinese competitors. It is inevitable that they will achieve a scale at a certain point in time. And we think that it's, although we are trying to prevent it from happening, we're trying to preempt it. However, it will become a reality. And our mitigation is that, number one, we want to source from the same suppliers they'll be sourcing with. We want to use the advantage in terms of time to go to the Chinese market early and try to get these suppliers on our side. At least we get to tap into that resource as well. And second, we want to increase barriers to entry. Again, the charging stations will be exclusive use for LG, Samsung, and Panasonic. This is going to be a big investment that can give us a moat versus the Chinese competitors who will have to develop this on their own. And however, again, in the worst case scenario, look at our contingency.
Team, your team is out. I'm sorry.
Added value. And
I
we think
have-
that's how we're going to succeed
I
in the
have to
market.
interrupt.
Thank you, and already.
Thank you very much. Thank you, team theater next. Please, judges.
I'm really, really big on presentation style and skills, and I love your presentation. And you guys look comfortable, confident, very experienced public speaker. I love little touches like you have your car strategy. It's a car scenario, so you have car strategy. I love the fact that you put in your personal reference that I love to use a romantic friendly car, but all these problems. I love the fact that you put a little bit of humor of the story of matching cars. And I think what is good as well is because you're referring back to your teammates' presentation and it shows teamwork. So I think this is a big thumbs up for your presentation skills. Only two little criticism. First of all is you cram so much into your presentation. I'm just like, I'm running after you guys. And as judges, we're getting old, our expression span is very short. So you need to be a little bit sharper, right? Have the points come out a little bit more. This is fantastic, but you have the idea, but you didn't really capitalize it for me. You need to make it a little bit sharper because towards the end you were rushing, right? Second thing is the slides. You have different people writing the slides. So look and feel is not there. Try to have one person to do the slides. They will look a lot more professional. Right, that's it.
Now the hard work.
Yeah.
Good, the bad ones.
Judges, if you also have any questions regarding the presentation.
Yeah, that's the hard work.
We're coming in now. Yeah. So you mentioned that the electric vehicles are such a small part of sales. I think 3% is the number you threw out. And you talked about the problem of demand. It's just not there. You talked about how high prices, potentially not enough charging stations. But think of it from the car perspective, the manufacturer. They generate a lot of sales not from electric vehicles. What really incentivizes them to work with the battery manufacturers to even spend any time on something that's going to destroy the rest of their business?
Alright, thank you, sir, for that question. Really, one of the main issues right now is really the concern for the environment, and it's really a rising concern. And even not just consumers, but also governments are very concerned about this. There have been alliances, there have been organizations which were formed just to make sure that the environment is protected, that climate change is mitigated, the risks of this is mitigated. So really, there is a need for electric cars right now. So automobile manufacturers will have to produce these electric vehicles because, as we said, it is the future. We believe that this is where the future is going. This is where cars will be a few years from now, because there is a need, and it is an urgent need which cannot really be ignored. So they have to spend.
Just add to what Marta talked about. In terms of incentives, we do recognize that although there is a need, and for example, rising oil prices have actually disrupted the car industry and have made people look towards alternative sources of energy. That's why the Prius sold really well, for example, in the United States. However, in terms of really the incentives, we do recognize that for a car manufacturer, it's probably not their priority. That's why we feel that the responsibility actually rests on the battery manufacturers, because they have the most vested interest in making electric vehicles a reality, or a commercially viable reality. Because we feel that they have to. That's the reason why we put a lot of effort in terms of looking at what the battery manufacturers can do to urge the ecosystem forward. Because the car manufacturers are willing to tap into it. Yes, it's lucrative sometimes. However, we understand that there might already be inhibitions on their part. And though they have shown good faith in terms of trying to develop the technology, we still think that in terms of urging them forward, it's really going to be the battery manufacturers. And if you make it cheap enough, if you make it perform well for these car manufacturers, definitely they'll be ready to take on your technology and really sell it to the end consumer. So we feel that a lot of the improvement and the development really comes from the battery manufacturers.
Just to add to what Janina said, so we really have to question then, why are car manufacturers even going into electric powered vehicles right now? And we think it's because they understand that electric vehicles are an eventuality. It's not just that it can be an alternative to oil consuming cars, but really that the market is going to go there because oil consumption is finite. Oil in itself is finite, and when you're running low on the supply of oil, what then is the next thing that we sell? What then is the next car that we produce? So we think that a lot of their investments right now are really looking long term and looking for maybe not 10 years down the line, but 50 years down the line, 30 years down the line, So we think that they have a vested interest in actually making sure that cars are efficient, that people will want to buy electric powered cars. And we think that even though it doesn't contribute a lot to their sales now, it will in the future. So that's why they're thinking about the long term. They're looking at the investment and saying that, okay, it's not really contributing a lot to my company now, but it is the future of my company. So I need to invest in it, making sure that the technology is there, the infrastructure is there, everything else is in place, so that when the time comes, I can actually leverage on this.
Maybe I think leading from this particular question and the conversation which you've had, this was a business problem or a technology problem? And if it's something which is being driven by a disruptive technology, should the solutions also come partially, if not largely, from a technology solution and not primarily from a business strategy or a financial engineering solution? Let me elaborate upon that. You referred to the range anxiety that people drive this car and have to begin worried about the battery running out. The solution for that recommended was have more charging stations. Even if we have more charging stations, do you think consumers will buy in to the idea of having to charge a car every, let's say, once every 5 kilometers, which is the current maximum range for any battery operated car? So, therefore, would the solution rather not come from investing in R&D in making the battery performance, the range of car on a full charge be more, rather than just investing in more and more charging solutions?
We think that it's not going to come from one side or the other. We think that definitely technology needs to catch up to where it's efficient enough for not just 175 kilometers, like you said, like compared to gasoline powered cars, that's very little and very inefficient right now. And we think that that's something that they have to look into. But at the same time, you have to make incentives for customers to be on board as soon as possible. You can't just wait for technology to take 10 years or 20 years down the line. You also have to draw the interest of your consumers as well. And that's why we think that charging stations are a way to actually meet them halfway. You can't, like, you're also piquing the interest of consumers, but at the same time developing the technology. And we think that piquing that interest is necessary in order to actually get the funding or get the support needed to develop that technology further. So in that sense, you can't just look at it from a technology standpoint and think that, well, we'll just wait till it's ready. We have to actually drive the market to want it to be ready and then develop the technology from there.
Thank you. Time for one more question. A follow-up?
Sure, just go ahead.
So just something leading from that one is, this is obviously regarded as the new technology. And if you look at the parallels with any other disruptive technology, primarily semiconductor industry, and you've got a lot of Moore's law, which indicated that every 18 months, the capacity, the power of a semiconductor will double, right? And that's what drove the performance of the whole industry as we know it today. What is the equivalent of Moore's law for the battery industry led car?
Actually, one of the trends that we saw in rechargeable batteries is number one in terms of cost. We saw that over in the span of about 2 years, the cost for 10,000 kilowatt hour battery actually was cut into a third of what it used to be. So efficiencies are being made, and we're actually very optimistic about the technology and how fast it's going to be. It's how fast it's going to develop in this industry. That's why the way we characterize the problem is that the technology will come. But however, we don't want these battery manufacturers to be playing a waiting game. We want them to urge it forward. And a big part of our strategy is about collaborating with the rest of the supply chain. And that involves a big part R&D. Because we feel that the investment of these companies are already in making sure that battery operated cars become a reality. It's not them checking if there's a market. We have to create the market. And we have to urge the R&D to get part. Again, we don't expect car manufacturers to do this on their own. It really rests with the battery manufacturers. And again, as Vito talked about, it's about gathering scale, enough money and enough profitability to make sure that money you're investing in R&D has a positive ROI. Or you're confident that you go back to your shareholders and tell them, I'm reinvesting 10% of all my revenues every year back into R&D and putting half my people in R&D because I know it's going to give us a good return. It's all about bringing the technology a bit faster and speeding it up by growing the market currently. So it's about meeting it half.
One of your arguments is that oil prices have been rising, so this is a great alternative. But in fact, recently oil prices have collapsed. And so, and you think about governments, they're pretty slow to respond to changing all of these emission limits. So now, before we talked about the manufacturers not really being incentivized to go with this, what do you think incentivizes consumers, right? They've already proven that, you know, if there's a gas station on every corner, now gas is so much cheaper. Do they really want to buy these cars? And if you're a manufacturer of batteries and there's no demand and you're just burning money, are you really in the right business?
We think there's actually a growing demand from a small consumer base, which is the people who are environmentally friendly. Because if you look at why people actually buy electronic cars today, it's not because it's cheaper, it's not because it's better, it's because they want to help serve the environment. So it's really growing this pool of customers and eventually using that growth to fund becoming better and having a greater product. And eventually, when it's good enough, it's going to disrupt the entire car manufacturing industry. Because a lot of people who are sensitive about the price and quality will move on to the added benefits of being environmentally friendly that electronic cars have. So when we think about whether oil prices will actually affect the decision of these consumers who care more about environment, we think that there's a big enough consumer base and that it's growing enough that it won't be super affected by the lowering price of oil.
Just to add to that, we think that the reason why oil prices are lowering right now isn't because they suddenly found abundant oil and now oil is not a problem. It's because a lot of what makes oil, or a lot of the people who make oil, are government run. And when oil consumption was going down because of looking at alternative technology, they didn't lay off the workers, they didn't reduce their production of oil, and that really led to an oversupply of oil, and that's why oil prices are right now down. But we think that in the long term, oil will still be a finite resource. Oil will still run out, and these companies still have an incentive to actually go for this type of technology. So even if right now consumers might not have the best incentive to go right away into electric powered vehicles, we still think that car manufacturers, battery manufacturers have to invest in it because it is still going to be an eventuality that we'll get to maybe 20 or 30 years down the line.
So just on that point, how many years are you willing to lose money until that 20 to 30 years plays out? Remember, electric cars were conceived even before the 70s, right? What year are we up to? 2015? 2035. This is not a profitable business, right? The demand you've just kind of confirmed is not happening. It's a small piece of the puzzle. So how do you stay in business in a market that's just becoming more competitive, where you're not going to make any money for a very long time?
So the first thing we think we have to do is we have to look into greater efficiencies and lowering down the cost as much as possible to cater to those people who prioritize cost. But more than that, like Patrick said earlier, we want to target mainly the early adopters first, because we believe those are the ones who are going to be most open to this type of technology. But we believe that even though oil prices right now are low, we don't think that that's going to stick for the long future. We think that eventually oil prices will rise again, and when that time comes, it may not be 20 years down the line like earlier, but it might be sooner, we don't really know. But when that happens, then people will start thinking, oh, there have been so many efficiencies gathered by electric powered vehicles, maybe we should turn there. So we think that although our maximum potential might come 30 years down the line where everyone switches to electric powered vehicles, even 10 years down the line, we're going to have a lot of people who are going to be interested in actually shifting. And it's going to be actually a viable solution then, because oil prices will be rising by then. So we think that even though we can't maximize profitability 10 years down the line, we can definitely have a market that will be capable to carry us through the rest of the way.
I guess just to close that out, at the end of the day, the mere fact that oil is volatile, whether it's going up or going down, and it keeps vacillating between prices, already stirs up the concern from consumers that, you know what, this is a finite resource and it's not reliable. If I buy a car now, it's cheaper now, but tomorrow it might not be cheaper. So that volatility actually works for consumers rethinking their purchasing, and actually maybe if it's more economically sound to buy an electric car, why not? So we feel that making that possible, and the growth projections for EVs are actually 5 years down the line. 2020, if we think about 2020 is only 5 years from now. It's not even that far off, though it sounds like the far future. So 5 years from now, there is growth in the market in terms of projections. It's just about making sure right now that now the change is making sure that those projections actually are actually materialized and not just end up in futility like it did in the past. So it's about an active effort on the part of the battery manufacturers, which we feel they haven't done so in the past, that they can do now to make sure that 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, and eventually 30 years down the line, everybody's using electric cars.
Final question for me. Within your 4 families, how many electric vehicles are
Alright, so we come from the Philippines.
there? No.
Although they sell Priuses in
They do sell
yes,
Priuses.
and
And I
there
think
is
one of the main problems is because we don't have charging stations.
Right. we do have hybrid gasoline, for example. It's ethanol and petroleum. So there, and a lot of the taxi cabs are going to LPG. So the sentiment for moving away oil, because I think we suffer the most when it comes to oil, because oil prices in Manila are exorbitant. Plus the traffic, we spend a lot. So we feel that in the Philippines, we're not a mature market for this. However, if in the Philippines we got to convince people to switch to LPG or to even buy 1 or 2 Priuses every 3 years or something, we think that what more in Japan, what more in Europe, what more in the United States, where the growth is anyway, and where the early adopters are, and even in China because there's such a big populace, and that there rich people are there's so many new rich people in China, and we don't want them ending up smashing up their investments in Tesla cars. So we just want to make it a reality, and we feel very positive about it using this strategy.
Thank you guys.